afternoon, Patriots. This is the American Vision, broadcast on the TLB TV network and brought to you by the Liberty Beacon Project. I'm your host, Bill Muckler, and I'm coming to you from my home studio in Cocoa, Florida, on America's beautiful Space Coast. And today I'm honored to have a special guest, and a guest that I've interviewed and talked with a year ago. And in the meantime, she's published a fifth book and working on a sixth book and has been writing articles practically every day. And that's Dr. Ileana Johnson Paugh. And Ileana, welcome to the American Vision. I'm just so glad to have you on, and it's a delight to have you with us again.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you for having me again.
Now, for those who don't know Dr. Johnson, or Ileana, she's from Romania. She's an American citizen by choice, and is so much wisdom and insight on what's happening in the world today after living in communism. And today what we want to do is we want to talk about her book that she wrote called UN Agenda 21. And this is something that I didn't really know a whole lot about. In fact, when I wrote my book and I wrote a chapter on the United Nations, I didn't really know as much as I do now. So what I want to do is I want to learn, and hopefully we can help others learn just what UN Agenda 21 is. So Ileana, maybe you can start out by just telling us how this all got started, when it happened back in 1992, and just what it's all about, and then we can talk more about how it's affecting us here in America today.
Yes, thank you, Bill, for having me. I'll start with 1992 because that's when this Agenda 21 was ratified by 178 countries in Rio de Janeiro, as you said, in 1992. And this convention, which was presented as an environmental convention, environmental protection convention, has about 40 chapters, and it has been actually proposed prior to that in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, under different formats, but with the same basic agenda, which is global communism under the control or the aegis of the United Nations. They want to control every facet of human existence, whether it's economic, social, gender, educational, you name it, labor. It's all, they want to control it all. And George Bush, President Bush at the time, signed us into this convention, but only two of the three. He rejected the third because it had too much to do with intellectual property, which people were supposed to give for free to third world countries. And because of that, that part was never ratified. However, it was introduced bit by bit around the world and in our country at the local level. And I didn't know really anything about this until 2008 when I moved to Northern Virginia, when I became interested and intrigued into various coincidences of these strange individuals coming to our county and telling us about their visioning, these committees that nobody knew anything about, and they already had something planned for us. And then I learned about ICLEI, which about 600 cities in the country were members of. And these ICLEIs were actually NGOs that were funded by billionaires from different parts of the world to indoctrinate localities and state governments to their visioning of how the planet should look like, which was basically borderless, under the control of the United Nations and a few billionaires at the top. And meaning that we would have to give up our sovereignty, and pretty much everything we do as we currently do would become unsustainable, meaning that it has to be controlled. And I became more intrigued when local people I have met who owned a farm were told that they couldn't have certain things on the farm. And more stories came from around the country. And then the smart meter craze started rolling in, which is also part of Agenda 21. So I became interested in researching more and more about it. As I did, and I found evidence of the insidiousness of it, people called me all sorts of names, of which probably tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist was at the top. And how can you be a conspiracy theorist when the documents are there spelling clearly what their intentions are?
Yes, and I know, and when you mentioned President Bush, just so our viewers know, we're talking about President Bush 41, and if
Yes.
we remember during his tenure in office, he talked about the New World Order, and the New World Order really has to do with the United Nations taking over the entire world and leaving the United States as just one mere state in that entire United Nations.
That's correct. And if you look at the history of this New World Order, you can actually trace it back to almost 100 years ago. There have been different attempts, so the most prominent being Mr. Rhodes from Great Britain, after which the famous Rhodes scholarships were named. And if you look at most of the recipients of Rhodes scholarships are all highly liberal Democrats in general.
Yeah.
A few conservative or Republicans have received the Rhodes Scholarship. The most famous recipient, of course, being Bill Clinton, that we all know. And of course, I met personally President Bush. He actually handed me my PhD diploma in 1989, and how was I to know at the time, that he was 3 years later was going to sign our country into global communism. And at the time, he shook my hand and told me how sorry he was that my daddy passed away the day before at the hands of communists. And how was I to know that this man had actually signed us onto future global communists? Had no idea.
Mm-hmm. But in your book, as I read your book, and I have to tell our audience that Ileana sent me her book, the print copy, and I also then got it on Kindle because I wanted to take a lot of notes because I'm learning so much about this. Your research has just been so extensive on this. I would imagine from everything I've seen, you've done more research on Agenda 21 than anyone else has. I can't imagine anyone else has. Now, something that really concerns me is I kind of feel like in America, we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but really what makes America so much different than other countries is we have the right of ownership. We can own our homes, our automobiles. We can own our rights, like in the First Amendment, and all these things. And it seems to me like Agenda 21 is just an insidious way of taking away our freedoms to a point that we will not have ownership anymore. And in reading your book, maybe you can, I felt like I got that, I understood it. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about how this Agenda 21 obviously can't be legislated, because if it was legislated, the people in America would learn about it and they would reject it. But what they do is they bring it into our communities through, like you said, non-governmental organizations, and push for all these various aspects of Agenda 21.
That's correct. And they, of course, their number one goal is to abolish private property. Private property is on the list, which is a very long list of everything that's unsustainable in our current Western civilization. And people learn about it through encounters of various private citizens who are told what they can and cannot do with their properties. The most, one of the more recent examples comes from Michigan. This was from October 26th. Two brothers in Michigan were fined $450,000 for cutting down trees on their own property without asking the tyrants in government for permission first. And their names are Gary and Matt Piracy, who own a 16-acre piece of property in the Canton Township, and they wanted to start a business where they would create from their private property a Christmas tree farm. Well, to do that, you're going to have to cut down a lot of bushes and wild trees and so forth, invasive plants like phragmites, buckthorn, and autumn olive. But apparently, the Canton people in the township, the government, said that you should have gotten permission. You cut down about 1,385 trees with trunk diameters of 6 inches or more. And that meant that he paid fines, or they assessed fines, of $225 to $300 per tree in penalties. And, and obviously, since they owned the property, they felt that they could do whatever they wanted with their property. Well, it isn't so, because this particular township was under a project installed by ICLEI, and that required that they get the government's permission to do anything on the property. So
perhaps you could tell us, you mentioned ICLEI a few times, and I know what it is, but perhaps you can tell us, that's the acronym, or what the acronym stands for.
ICLEI is actually the organization. I think they changed the name to the Governmental Climate Partnership or something of that nature. Is no longer ICLEI. And what they do, they send a committee or a commission of their already trained NGO operatives who have a plan designed in mind how they're going to develop the community in terms of how the land will be used, how it will be divvied up, what kind of properties can and can not be built, how tall the buildings have to be, how the water will be used, and so forth. What roads, will they be narrowed? Will they have bike paths? They have this big walkability in Agenda 21 where people are supposed to live and work 5 minutes away, and they have to walk or ride a bike or take public transportation, no cars. And then these people come to the Board of Supervisors and say, well, this is a good plan for your community, and look at all the government funds and other enticements that we have, and grants that we have attached to this plan. And if you accept it and vote for it, then the money will come to you free of charge, no interest, and you don't have to repay it. And I'm not sure that in every community that belonged to this ICLEI, they knew exactly what they were signing on to. They just got enticed by the money, or maybe one or two knew exactly what was going on and they went along with the program. But they presented these plans, and in each area the plans have different names, and they were usually liberals are very good at finding euphemism that sounds so good to us. It's almost like a kumbaya level of good. And in reality is not good for the community, because a person cannot, for example, collect snow melt on their property or rainwater because they get penalized. There was a guy in Oregon who went to jail for 30 days because he collected snow melt in barrels on his own property. You have a little rain puddle and that's considered a marshy area, and you cannot drain it. You can't bring dirt or rocks or whatever. You can't plant a bush in certain areas because it obstructs the view shed. Um, I have a friend who lives here in a county nearby, and she had a farm, and she was inviting students to come and see how she took care of rescued animals. And um, she had a conservation easement contract when she bought the property, which is another way to control somebody's property, where your taxes are reduced under the condition that you have to ask permission for the NGO that holds this conservation easement on your property, which is a contract, if you want to do anything to your property. And sometimes the contract is signed in perpetuity because the people don't know what they're signing. They think, oh, it's great, I don't have to pay taxes, or wow, my taxes are so much lower if I sign onto this contract. But these people would come to her house on this farm and actually look in her closets to see if she had clothes or furniture, because there was not supposed to be a house on the property, just farming. Then she couldn't keep the cows on 20 acres so they can use the shade from the trees, because the conservation NGO that had their contract said that, oh, Stonewall Jackson overnighted on this property and it has historical value, so you can't do that. You can't change anything. And it came out later in lawsuits that Stonewall Jackson was nowhere near the property. And yet she was denied use of that piece of property, about 20 acres, for about 4 years, 4 or 5 years. So,
and speaking of denying people of property, part of Agenda 21, and you mentioned it before, people living within 5 minute walk or bike ride of their of where they work. What they really want to do is take away our property and relocate everyone into high-rise apartment buildings in a central city area, I presume, or a central urban area, I guess I should say. So it seems to me like that's not the way the American people really want to live.
Not really. And also part of Agenda 21 is the idea that you should live in tiny apartments and tiny homes, which are 600 or less square feet. Some live in 200 square feet or 150 or 250. And to put it in perspective, the average hotel room is about 600 square feet or less. So that's how they want you to live. And I've lived in such an apartment under communism, and I can tell you it was no fun. And we were forcibly removed from the land. The land was confiscated and collectivized for the common good, for agriculture. And then all the peasants were moved into the city in high-rise apartments, 5 to 9 stories high. And they were just teeny tiny.
So, yeah, and you also mentioned something else about smart meters, and I read so much about that. People don't understand that, and I think some people have accepted smart meters and not really knowing what they are, and also the health effects of them, or the I should say damaging health effects of them.
Oh, of course. I talked about smart meters in my book. I think I have a couple of chapters where I give examples of what they have done to people's health in certain areas who are sensitive to the radiation that's emitted nonstop by these smart meters. And I even went to Richmond. We had a commission that was supposed to decide if these smart meters were mandatory or not. At the time they were. Now we can opt out of them and just have normal smart meters. And it's a very invasive way to control everything you do in your home without a warrant. That's what these smart meters are, in addition to the health issues that many people who are allergic to certain things are also allergic to this radiation, which if you look at all the technology that we're surrounded by, everything that's emitted has some kind of radiation that may or may not be good cumulatively for the human body. Um, so I think people have been fighting against them around the country, and many states do have opt-outs from these, but originally, initially, they were not, you couldn't opt out. But of course, you do have to pay a little more for the traditional one because the power company claims that they have to send somebody to read your meter, whereas with the smart meters, they can do it from the mothership, wherever that is, away. So, anyway, and of course, smart meters are not reliable in terms of your consumption. Most of the people have complained how much more expensive their electric bills have been since these smart meters were installed, and it is an issue of privacy. Anyway, you asked me earlier what ICLEI stands for, and as I said, it has changed to something else, so it doesn't have such negative connotations, but it's the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. That's the acronym for ICLEI. And like I said, there were about 600 cities that belong to this ICLEI, and they were actually paying money to be members. They're paying money to destroy their sovereignty at the local level and destroy their private property rights at the local level. I think now they change the name to something local government initiatives or something like that.
But everything that they talk about, they use these terms like smart meters and sustainability, and it, like you say, it all sounds so wonderful, but it's really a way to take over our rights and get us to a point where we're almost servants to a one world order.
Well, we really are. And if you look at things like the HOA, the Homeowners Association, that was an earlier form of property control, and people had signed on to it because they thought, well, our property values are going to be preserved, maintained, and that's not the case. They just want to tell you what to do from the environmental point of view, not from maintaining the value of your home. They don't really care about that. It's just another arm of this property rights and property control. And of course, as you said, sustainable development is the linchpin of Agenda 21 or Agenda 2030, as they call it now. And everything, if you look at every government organization in this country or in another country, has the word sustainable development. Any kind of plan, with even the military has sustainable development plans. And now we cannot even have international trade without sustainable development. And it's actually made its way into the USMCA trade agreement, United States, Mexico, Canada trade agreement, which is supposed to replace NAFTA. And although the agreement has some very good parts, it has some very negative parts in terms of we can't do trade without sustainable development and biodiversity all of a sudden. And Article 2418, and this trade document is huge. It's almost 2,000 pages, and I doubt any congressman that's going to vote on this is going to read it. It's been written for the past 2 years, and it's been written probably by the same people in the Obama administration that wrote the NAFTA, or tweaked NAFTA, I should say. And of course, in Article 2418, which is entitled Sustainable Fisheries Management, there's a a paragraph that includes a footnote, number 13, which says that whatever they do in this entire chapter in regards to sustainable management, international trading in fisheries, it has to abide by the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, or LOST. The acronym is LOST, LOST. And the United Nations Agreement for the Implementation of the Provisions of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea of December 1982. Well, this Law of the Sea Treaty has been attempted to be ratified by Congress for many, many years, and each time it has failed. So this time they're introducing it through the back door to this USMCA. It's sort of like Nancy Pelosi saying, oh, you've got to pass the Affordable Care Act to find out what's in it. And we did find out, because it was a very unaffordable Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. So this is not good for the United States, because it you actually lose sovereignty over your economic activity, specifically in this case over fishing and fisheries and fish management. And speaking of this Law of the Sea Convention, not only does it control the amount of fishing that you can do and where you can fish, but where you can cross through international waters, what are your mineral rights, how much do you have to pay the United Nations if you explore the oceans in any part of the world, and how you have to contribute 7%, I believe, to the United Nations' own effort to do marine exploration for various minerals and fossil fuels. So this is a very, very insidious way of passing the United Nations wishes without actually going to Congress and doing it that way, presenting it as a free trade agreement. And people are not going to read the 2,000-page document, and neither are congressmen, particularly that idiot from New York who was just elected, who has no clue what's going on in the planet. I don't know how she ever got an economics degree. And she's going to vote on this USMCA free trade agreement.
Yeah,
So
that's sad. But as you're talking about this, I don't think people understand how this could affect their daily lives. For example, if I looked at the European Union, and Great Britain just left the European Union, they called it Brexit, exiting from Britain, exiting from the EU. One of the problems that the people in Great Britain had is that people in The Hague were making rules and regulations and passing laws that affected the people in England and in the other countries in the European Union, France and Germany and Italy and Spain, etc. And those people had no say in their local government or even their country's government. So what I see is Agenda 21, which was the UN's agenda for the 21st century, which now has become Agenda 2030, which I guess is going to something we can look forward to in another 11 or 12 years. It means that somewhere, whether it's in New York or The Hague, laws are going to be passed that are going to actually directly affect you in Virginia, me in Florida, and the people in the United States. And we will have no say whatsoever on this. And it almost takes us back to the reason why this country was actually founded, was taxation without representation. This is going to be complete non-representation for the American people.
Of course, since you brought up Brexit, one of the key reasons for Britain exiting the European Union, which is now turning into a militarized force. They have a military now, or at least Mrs. Merkel proposed a military. But one of the reasons was the fishing restrictions which were placed by the EU on Britain. Not only did they destroy the fishing industry in Britain, but they also destroyed every other industry that was dependent on the fishing industry in Britain. So, and how do they do that? Well, the British fishing industry was forced to cede to the fishing industry of other countries that couldn't compete with the British fishing industry, and if it was allowed to succeed. So basically, it will happen the same here, although we would have a highly competitive industry and you will have supply and demand rules of free market economics. By being under the United Nations control, you would have to cede everything to a third world nation and even donate proceeds to landlocked countries who can't even go fishing. It seems like a lot of congressmen are in favor of ramming this UMCA agreement through, and those who are clueless, like the newly elected people in Congress, are just going to basically go along with their party. In this case, the Democrat Party, and perhaps part of Republicans will go along with it. Like Orrin Hatch, he's a Republican from Utah. He's all for it. So yes, it will affect the lives of you and me and everybody else in the United States, and we would have no say-so whatsoever because it will come from the United Nations. And most of these organizations and committees with the United Nations are staffed by tin pot dictatorships. And they will dictate to us what to do and where the money will go. And it's very, very sad. If you look at the United Nations, every organization that's associated with the United Nations have now adopted the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I'll read them quickly because they will affect you and me and everybody else in this country. Number one, there's no poverty. That means that there has to be transfer of wealth from us because we're so rich to everybody else in the country. And we will have to put up with all this migration, forced migration from the United Nations. They are organizing that so-called caravan and all these illegals that are crossing the southern border. They didn't just spontaneously organize. The second goal, sustainable development goal, is zero hunger. That means the richer countries are going to have to grow the food and feed everybody else so they don't starve. And as we feed everybody else, they're going to start multiplying because they are, that's what happens. They have a lot of babies, whereas Western civilization, they do have entered a demographic suicide. They have less and less babies. The third goal is good health, meaning that we're going to give all these drugs and medical care for free to the third world. Number four, quality education. Well, who decides what's quality education? Would that be better said indoctrination into globalism? And we see it in every public school in the country. They are now told they're global citizens, divorced from their history, and they're laughing at their history, and they're not even taught their real, their nation's history. Number five goal is gender equality. And the Committee at the United Nations on Gender Equality is staffed with a lot of countries that are Muslim. And you know there's no gender equality in a Muslim society. Number six, clean water and sanitation. Well, I hope it happens, but guess who's going to pay the bill? We are. Number seven, affordable and clean energy. Hence, they're pushing solar power and wind turbines. none of it can be done without fossil fuels. All these people driving around in their Priuses and their Teslas, and oh, we're not polluting the environment. They're just deluded. Where is the electricity coming from? It's coming in a high percentage from fossil fuels, from hydroelectric power and nuclear power, which they liberals also are against. There's just not enough solar power and wind turbine to generate the amount of electricity that's needed in an economy the size of ours. Number 8 sustainable development goal is decent work and economic growth. Who's going to pay for that? We are. Number 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, meaning that we're going to have to innovate and build the infrastructure of all these third world nations, but not ours, because we will be told at local and state levels what we can and cannot do when we build in our communities. Number 10, reduce inequalities, meaning that you're going to pay the same amount of money for a person who has no work ethic as opposed to a person who does. Or education-wise, a person who is better educated or better motivated and has more experience will have to make the same amount of money as someone who isn't. Number 11, sustainable cities and communities. That is basically Agenda 21, being herded into high-rise apartments and tiny spaces. Number 12, responsible production and consumption. The United Nations will tell you what you can and cannot produce, and they will tell you what you can and cannot consume. For example, we are told that we are a high meat consumption society, and that has to stop. Number 13, climate action. They're talking about the bogus global warming, and they're just now articles coming out about the faulty data that even Al Gore used before he got his Nobel Prize for the inconvenient truth, whatever. But he made billions in the process, and people believe that global warming is caused by human activity, which is not true. Number 14 is life below water. They're going to be in control, telling you everything that you can and cannot do in the water. I have to agree that from the conservation point of view, we have to rein in some of these third world countries that don't have a way to dispose of garbage, and they dump everything into the ocean. Number 15 is life on land. They will control everything we do on land. Number 16, they will force peace, justice, and strong institutions under the United Nations control. And number 17, partnership for sustainable development goals. If you noticed, and I don't know if you have, or many citizens, but in every community and every government level, there's now a private-public partnership, which is a marriage between billions from very wealthy people and either state, local, or federal government, again, telling us how to live our lives. And that's sustainable development.
So really, as I'm listening to this, what you're describing to me is a massive redistribution of wealth, property, and food to the rest of the world to, in a sense, put together a one world socialist communist government.
Correct. That's absolutely correct. And if I may, I don't know how much time we have left. My good friend Tom DeWeese has the American Policy Center, where he goes around the country and tries to educate people about Agenda 21 and how to rein in these private property abuses, which you can Google it and find many, many examples. And here are some of his most recent successes that appeared in his report in the month of November. In South Carolina, activists stopped a community sustainable development plan, which they have these probably in every part of the country. In Michigan, after he spoke to them, a very courageous activist managed to get property rights language in his community plan, and he wants to have all the members of his township board removed from office because they are corrupt and they're beholden to a foreign power. United Nations is a foreign power. They may be in the United States, in New York, but they are not working for the benefit of United States citizens. In Nebraska, two determined city councilmen who have read what Tom provided them recognized that their corrupt city administrator was systematically enforcing sustainable policy at his whim, ignoring pretty much any of their attempts to voice opposition. So they asked Tom for help, and they are now working to have this person removed from office as well. He was asked to speak in Los Angeles. He was very surprised, to a large association of landlords who learned that they were targets of a direct attack on their private property through sustainable development rules and regulations. And of course, he educated them what they're facing and how they can start fighting back. Then he was invited to Oklahoma City to speak to a cattlemen's association who were trying to stop radical environmentalists from destroying their cattle industry. As I mentioned earlier to you, meat consumption is unsustainable, farming is unsustainable, paving roads is unsustainable, golf courses are unsustainable, parking lots are unsustainable. They're ripping them off and replacing them. Dams are unsustainable. You're supposed to destroy dams, which destroys irrigation and agriculture. And pretty much organized agriculture is considered unsustainable. I don't know what people are supposed to eat, but I don't think they care about this because they say the planet is overpopulated and it should have 500 million to 1 billion humans on it, no more. So how they're going to dispose of the other 6 billion or 6.5 billion, I have no idea. Here's some more victories that Tom has scored. The HUD Secretary Ben Carson is finally taking action to roll back the disastrous Obama-created Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Initiative. The acronym is AFFH, which Tom has been pressuring to do. And Secretary Carson opened up an opportunity for comments from the public, and Tom has delivered to him personally over 1,000 comments. In the community of Bayou La Batra, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, in Alabama, local activists who had been alerted to Agenda 21 through one of his speeches were able to recognize and end a growing threat to their community from radical environmentalists who were coming in to change the local rules. So if they had a hurricane or if they had a tornado and a property was destroyed, they would not be allowed to rebuild, even if that property was a business. In a rural area outside of Shreveport, Louisiana, local residents armed with Tom's materials were able to defeat the creation of the Cato Lake National Heritage Area, because these environmentalists are very fond of creating heritage areas all over the place where no construction, no change is allowed, and sometimes human trespassing through the area is also forbidden. The City Council of Hesperia, California became the first city to reject Agenda 21 policy when it opted out of San Bernardino County vision statement. This threw kind of a major money wrench into the plans for the regional government through the San Bernardino Council of Governments. And as I said earlier to you, each area chooses one euphemistic name or another for this Agenda 21 regionalist plan. Activists are using our candidates' promise to protect property rights to confront their candidates as they campaign. So if you write to Tom, he can send you a copy of this candidate's promise to protect property rights. And he was successful in launching the Property Rights Network by holding his first national conference call, and several hundred activists and elected officials joined the call to begin the process of sharing ideas, networking, and learning how to fight back. And to me, that is essential in rejecting this Agenda 21, because most people are too busy to read 40 chapters of the actual document, which is Agenda 21.
Well, you've certainly educated us, and I've learned so much more even after reading the books just from listening to you talk. And there's probably a lot more that we can talk about. And you mentioned, maybe we don't have enough time. I think we probably have to say, this is all we can cover today, but maybe we can get back together again and cover some more of this, because there's just so many aspects to this Agenda 21 and what the United Nations is doing. So I thank you so much for your wisdom and your perspective and enlightening all of us on what's happening here. And we as Americans have to be educated to stop this Agenda 21 or Agenda 2030 with whatever it's going to evolve into.
Yeah, we have to. And I think people are waking up. I just hope they're waking up in time.
Well, I do too. So, Ileana, thank you so much for being a guest on the American Vision. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Bill, for having me. Until next time.
Okay. I want to thank everybody for watching our show today, and I hope you got as much out of this from Dr. Johnson as I have. And Ileana is such a great guest. She's such an intelligent person and has such great wisdom and perspective. And after living in communism, in communist Romania for the first 20 or so years of her life, and had the opportunity to come to America, she appreciates how much our freedom is and our sovereignty is. And the United Nations is determined to take that away from us and distribute everything we have to the rest of the world. In the meantime, achieving their agendas of decreasing the world population and turning us all into hunter-gatherers, which us probably don't want to be. And so that's what it's all about. Now, I wrote a book, 2020, A Clear Vision for America, and I'm finishing up my book, 2020, A Clear Vision for Our Future, which I talked to Dr. Johnson about this, and I actually have the hard copy book, and I also have the Kindle book, which I went ahead and got so I could highlight and use for my research. So I'm going to have some of her wisdom in my book, which will be a great improvement as well. So anyway, think about getting Dr. Johnson's book. We talked about him in the program we did a year ago. Her books on communism. There's two of them, and then a book on Agenda 21, and make great reading, great Christmas presents. And of course, my 2020, A Clear Vision for America will make a great Christmas present too. You can buy it for your friends, your family. Last year, for example, when Lady bought 3 copies just so she could send them out as Christmas presents, she thought they'd be great presents, and they were received very well. And I signed them all and write a nice inscription in there so people really feel like they're receiving something priceless. And actually, they are receiving the most priceless thing they can get, and that's a good book with a lot of good information in it to help us save our America and our American way of life. So everybody, remember, where there is no vision, the people perish. And God bless our America, and God bless all of our active duty personnel. And hopefully some of them can get home for the holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas. And God save our America. We need you more now than ever before.